They say every life has a moment when the truth refuses to stay quiet. When the version of yourself you've been pretending to be finally breaks under the weight of who you really are. For Dr. Amara Johnson, that moment arrived beneath a chandelier worth more than her entire grad school salary, in a ballroom overflowing with people who believed they were building the future. And right before she stepped inside, the man who claimed to love her leaned in close, adjusted his cufflink, and whispered the sentence that would change everything. Amara, don't make me look small tonight. If you've ever stood next to someone who was supposed to lift you up, but only used you as a mirror for their own ego, then you already know where this story is going. And if you're listening right now, take a breath, settle in, and if the opening of this story hits somewhere deep, don't forget to leave a comment about the line that struck you first, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next chapters. Some stories aren't just meant to be heard, they're meant to be lived through. Amara froze with her hand on the glass door. Outside, winter wind bit through her dress. Inside, the future of Innovation Gala glittered like a cathedral built for ambition. Gold, marble, and the hum of power vibrating beneath designer shoes. Ethan Clark stood beside her, immaculate in a midnight black tux, the kind of man who carried confidence like a second skin. Cameras flashed from inside, catching glimpses of billionaires, senators, and founders who shaped the world with their wallets. Amara knew the script she was expected to follow tonight. Be elegant, be quiet, be the impressive but not threatening wife of New York's favorite venture capital prodigy. But Ethan's whisper, sharp, low, and controlled, sliced deeper than any instruction she'd ever heard him give. Don't make me look small. Not, don't be nervous, or, I'm proud to have you here. No, just an order, a warning, a reminder of the shrinking she'd been practicing for months. Amara swallowed hard. She used to stand in community center classrooms filled with metal folding chairs and hope, teaching sociology to students who carried entire worlds in their eyes. Back then, her voice filled rooms, sparked debates, sometimes even saved a life. But tonight, even breathing felt like something that needed Ethan's approval. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm not trying to make you look small, she said softly. Ethan didn't look at her. He was scrolling through his phone, checking which journalists had arrived, which investors tagged him in their posts. Good, he murmured, because this room decides everything. When the doors opened fully, warm air swept around them, rich with perfume, polished wood, and the unmistakable scent of people who believed they were untouchable. A server in a crisp, white uniform glanced at Amara, hesitated as if uncertain whether she was a guest or part of the staff. It wasn't the first time. Ethan didn't notice, or pretended not to. He placed a guiding hand on the small of her back, the gesture tender enough for onlookers, but firm enough to communicate the rule: stay in line. Cameras flashed as they stepped onto the marble. Ethan straightened. His public smile clicked on instantly, charming, photogenic, presidential. Meanwhile, Amara felt her pulse thrum in her throat. A senator approached. Ethan, you made it. Ethan laughed in that polished way he had rehearsed for years. Wouldn't miss it. The senator turned to Amara. And this must be your assistant? Ethan squeezed Amara's waist before she could respond, steering the answer. My wife, he corrected smoothly. Dr. Johnson. The senator's eyebrows flicked upward. Oh, impressive. Amara offered a polite smile, but inside something trembled, something small, then growing. The night had only begun, and already she felt the familiar ache of invisibility pressing against her ribs. She had learned to suppress it. She had learned to adapt. She had learned to make herself smaller in rooms like this. But tonight, the air felt different, heavy, electric, like a storm was building inside her bones, searching for a place to break. Ethan leaned toward her again, still smiling for the cameras. Remember, he whispered without moving his lips, stay polished, No improv, no speeches, no sociology. He laughed lightly as if he were joking. It didn't feel like a joke. Not anymore. Amara inhaled slowly, tasting the metallic edge of truth rising in her chest. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of compromise and silence, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time whispered back, "But what if tonight I refuse to shrink?" And that, though she didn't know it yet, was the beginning of the end. Or the beginning of everything. Before Ethan became a chapter in her story, Amara Johnson's life was already full of meaning, stitched together with late-night lesson plans, cheap coffee, and the quiet miracles that happened in classrooms no one bothered to film. Her kingdom wasn't a marble lobby with revolving doors and security badges. It was a fourth-floor hallway in a Brooklyn public college, where the paint peeled, the elevators groaned, and every face that walked through her door carried a past the world had tried to erase. On Monday evenings, her classroom always filled up early. The desks were scratched, some wobbling on one broken leg, the overhead lights flickering like they were tired. But the room hummed with something expensive no billionaire in Ethan's world could buy. Raw, unfiltered hope. There was Rosa, who worked the morning shift at a nursing home and came to class in her scrubs, smelling faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion. There was Malik, who'd done 8 years upstate and couldn't shake the feeling that every security guard was still watching him. There was Jenny, a single mother who sometimes fell asleep mid-discussion, but still turned in essays written at 3 in the morning when her kids finally surrendered to sleep. "Good evening, Dr. J," they'd chorus when she walked in, and every time it tugged at something deep in her chest. Not because of the title, though she'd fought hard for that PhD, but because in their voices she could hear it. They believed she had something worth listening to. In that space, her words mattered. In that space, no one asked her to shrink. She'd write questions on the board in loopy, rushing handwriting. Who gets to be seen as intelligent? How does power decide whose story counts? They would stare, frown, argue, protest. Someone would mutter, "Dang, she always got to come for the whole system." And the room would laugh, and then they'd dig in. Amara lived for that moment when a student's eyes suddenly widened, when you could almost see an old lie cracking open in their mind. When Malik, quiet for weeks, finally spoke up and said, "Wait, so you're saying it's not that we're broken, it's that the game is rigged?" And the entire class went silent, hanging on her reply. "I'm saying you were never broken to begin with," she'd answer. "I'm saying you deserve to understand the rules that were written without you, so you can decide which ones you refuse to obey." After class, her students lingered. They always did. Some asked for help with citations. Some asked if it was too late to be the first in their family to finish college. Some just stood there, holding their notebooks like shields, trying to find the courage to say, "Can I tell you something I've never said out loud?" Amara listened, really listened, to stories of foster homes and deportation scares, of partners in jail and bosses who paid in cash but never on time. She never had the right answers to everything, but she knew the power of a person who wasn't afraid to look your pain in the face and not flinch. Her own apartment was a small walk-up in Crown Heights, the kind of place where the heat hissed and clanked in the winter, where you could hear your upstairs neighbor's music through the ceiling, where the hallway always smelled like someone's dinner. The furniture didn't match. Her couch was a hand-me-down from a colleague, her coffee table a repurposed crate. The only thing that looked intentional were the walls. On them she'd taped pages torn from old notebooks, scribbled quotes that had carried her through grad school. "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Your silence will not protect you. You are your best thing." Names like Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Angela Davis, her saints. On Sunday afternoons, her phone always rang at exactly 2 o'clock. "How's my professor?" Leonard Johnson would ask, his voice warm and rough with age and years of speaking truth where truth wasn't welcome. He'd retired from teaching history and practicing law, but his mind was sharp as ever. He still wore his glasses low on his nose, still tilted his head when she talked like he was examining an artifact in a museum, and she was the expert guide. "They're good, Daddy," she'd say, curling up by the window with her mug. Rosa cried during discussion when she realized literacy tests weren't about literacy at all. Malik said he didn't know his life could be something other than his record. And Jenny, you should read what she wrote about raising boys who are black and soft in a world that punishes both. Leonard would chuckle, that soft, proud sound. That's my girl, stirring up trouble in the best way. Sometimes he'd fall quiet and just listen to her ramble, her hands moving as if he could see them through the phone. "You do know," he'd say eventually, "that this is real power, right? Not the kind they put on magazine covers. The kind that changes what a person believes is possible for themselves." She'd roll her eyes out of habit, but her throat would tighten. "They barely pay me enough to afford groceries, Daddy." "I didn't say they valued it," he'd reply. "I said it was powerful." Those conversations were a tether, tying her to everything that mattered when the world tried to distract her with everything that didn't. Leonard never let her forget where she came from. A long line of people who'd fought, quietly and loudly, to make sure their children had a little more room to breathe than they did. Her grandmother cleaning offices at night so her son could go to college. Leonard marching when he was barely old enough to vote. Her mother singing in churches that couldn't afford choirs. Their stories hummed under her skin like background music, a reminder that she wasn't starting from zero. She was carrying a baton. On Friday nights, when most of her peers were out at bars or networking events, Amara sat cross-legged on her floor grading essays, surrounded by open books and half-eaten takeout. Sometimes she'd pause over a paper, eyes burning with tears because a student had written, "No one ever told me my opinion mattered until this class." She'd press her hand over those words, as if to bless them. Sometimes she'd laugh out loud at a joke in the margins. Sometimes she'd stare out the window at the city lights and feel, not lonely exactly, but aware of a space she hadn't filled yet. Because for all the fullness of her life, there were gaps. Nights when she wished someone was there to tell her she didn't have to be strong all the time. Mornings when she woke from dreams of conference panels and book jackets with her name on them, wondering if she'd chosen the smaller path. And always, always, the quiet ache that came from being perpetually underfunded, under-recognized, and overextended, even as her students' lives bloomed in front of her. If you had met her then, you might have thought she was content. And on most days, she was. What she did was enough. Who she was enough. But somewhere deep inside, the story she'd been telling herself about her future had started to fray at the edges, making just enough room for a different possibility to slip in. Not because she needed saving, not because her life was empty, but because even the strongest among us can be vulnerable in the exact place we believe we are safest. For Amara, that place wasn't her job, or her apartment, or even her faith in justice. It was her belief that she could always tell the difference between real love and a beautiful lie. Ethan Clarke did not enter the world polished, powerful, or destined for rooms where chandeliers sparkled like constellations trapped in glass. He was born in a two-bedroom house outside Toledo, Ohio, where winters were long, money was short, and silence often sat heavier than the snow. His father, a factory machinist, carried disappointment in his shoulders like permanent armor. His mother worked overtime at a dental clinic, stretching their income the way she stretched every meal, adding water to soups, reusing tea bags, insisting they were still good. From a young age, Ethan learned two truths. Power is the difference between being ignored and being heard, and people listen to whoever looks like they know where they're going. He watched his father lose his job after the plant downsized, watched the man's pride evaporate overnight. He watched landlords demand rent with an icy civility that made his mother's hands shake. He watched guidance counselors talk over him because he didn't have the right family name, the right money, the right promise. He absorbed every wound, every humiliation, every moment the world told him he didn't matter. So when he left for New York at 19, he wasn't chasing dreams so much as running from the version of himself he refused to become. He arrived with a duffel bag, one suit bought on clearance, and a rehearsed smile that didn't reach his eyes. The city didn't welcome him, it tested him. He slept on an air mattress in a Bushwick apartment where the walls shook whenever the subway passed. He interned at a startup that paid him nothing but leftover pizza and the illusion of potential. He spent nights reading books on charisma, leadership, negotiation, branding, anything that promised transformation. He reinvented himself piece by piece. He trained the Midwest softness out of his vowels. He practiced eye contact in the mirror until it felt like a weapon. He learned which watch to wear, which restaurants mattered, which wine labels made the right people nod in approval. He memorized the art of appearing effortless. He discovered the power of silence, the kind that forces others to fill it with their own insecurity. By 24, he had slipped into tech culture like a scalpel sliding into skin. Sharp, clean, unnoticed until it was too late. He joined a venture capital firm founded by 3 Stanford graduates who had never doubted whether they belonged anywhere. They saw Ethan as hungry, moldable, relentless, the perfect foot soldier. He became indispensable. He worked until dawn, strategizing how to pitch, how to close deals, how to charm founders with grand visions and investors with safe promises. He was the first to arrive and the last to leave, building spreadsheets like cathedrals and brand stories like myths. He learned how to make men twice his age trust him, how to make donors feel wise, how to make founders feel chosen. He developed an instinct for knowing what people wanted to hear and saying it before they knew they needed it. And yet, for all his new clothes and curated persona, Ethan remained haunted by the boy who had been overlooked, underestimated, unseen. He feared him. He rejected him. He vowed never to let him surface in front of people who mattered. So he built a shell, sleek, impenetrable, immaculate. But shells have cracks, even if you pretend not to see them. Ethan kept a mental ledger of every slight, every time someone implied he didn't belong in the elite world he now navigated. He remembered the partner who once joked that Ethan had the pedigree of a Walmart greeter. He remembered the billionaire who complimented him for being tough for someone without legacy. He smiled through it all, even as something hard and sharp calcified inside him. He promised himself that one day, no one would dare underestimate him again. One day he would stand so high above them that their jokes would become confessions of their own insecurity. One day he would be untouchable. And then came the night he saw Amara. It was at a fundraiser for educational equity held in a Harlem community center, nothing like the ballrooms he would one day command. The overhead lights buzzed. The chairs didn't match. The donors looked uncomfortable. But Amara stood at the front of the room speaking to a small crowd, her voice steady and alive with conviction. Ethan didn't understand half of the academic language she used, but he understood the electricity she generated. He watched adults lean forward, teenagers hold their breath, elders close their eyes as if her words were prayers. She wasn't performing. She wasn't selling anything. She wasn't wearing anything expensive. And still, she held the room. She held him. Something inside Ethan jolted awake, a mixture of admiration, hunger, and something darker. Here was someone who didn't need polish to command attention, someone who didn't bend her spine to fit into rooms or reshape her voice to soothe fragile egos, someone who believed power wasn't a pedestal but a responsibility, someone who came from a world he didn't understand but desperately wanted to claim a piece of. And he realized something that frightened him in its precision. If she stood next to him, if she walked into a room at his side, if she became part of his story, people would see him differently, better, more complete, more worthy. A white man from nothing, paired with a black woman who taught justice, impossibility, What better symbol of progress could he offer to a world obsessed with image? He approached her with a smile he had practiced for years, but for the first time, it felt almost genuine. "You speak like someone who believes what she says," he told her. Amara laughed, surprised. "Shouldn't we all?" He didn't know it yet, but in that moment, Ethan wasn't choosing love. He was choosing a path, a narrative, a mirror. And he had no idea the mirror he chose would one day shatter, reflecting the truth he had spent a lifetime trying not to face. In the beginning, Ethan loved Amara with a force that felt like weather, sweeping in fast, warm, and overwhelming. The kind of love that knocks the breath from your body before you realize you've stepped into a storm. Or at least, that's how it looked. That's how it felt. And for a long time, that was enough. He showed up in Amara's life the way light appears through blinds at sunrise. Sudden, soft, uninvited but welcome. After that community event in Harlem, he emailed her a thank you note so thoughtful it felt like he'd actually listened. 2 days later, he appeared at the college with boxes of new supplies for her students. Laptops, notebooks, writing materials, donated anonymously, though the staff whispered Ethan's name with admiration. A week later, he sat in the back row of her class taking notes, nodding along as though he were discovering revelations she had carried for years. He didn't just praise her, he amplified her. He didn't just listen, he absorbed. He didn't just watch, he memorized. And Amara, who had spent her adult life pouring into others, felt something pour back into her for the first time. He asked real questions about her research, her students, her father. He told her that her mind made him think differently, that her courage reminded him why change mattered, that she was the only person he'd ever met who made justice sound like poetry. He used her language, systems, equity, access, sprinkling the words into conversations like gifts he hoped she would notice. He introduced her to people who said things like, "Oh, you're Amara. He talks about you constantly," while clasping her hand like she was the missing piece of some moral puzzle. At galas, Ethan kept her close, proudly pointing her out as Dr. Johnson. She studies how inequality hides in plain sight. He said it with a spark in his eyes, like he was lucky to stand beside her, like he knew her worth, like he honored it. And for a time, he did. The world noticed them immediately. He was rising star investor. She was brilliant black academic. They looked like the kind of couple magazines write think pieces about, love and progress in the new generation. Photos of them at charity events began circulating online. A clip of Amara challenging a tech founder's assumptions went mildly viral, and Ethan stood beside her, smiling like he had won the lottery. He applauded her fierceness. He said she made him braver. He whispered things like, "You make me want to be a better man," and "I feel more grounded when you're around." The love bombing was disguised as partnership, dressed up as equality, wrapped in progressive language that made it feel enlightened rather than consuming. When Amara walked into a room with him, the air shifted. People leaned in. They listened. They wanted to know her story. And Ethan watched her, drinking in the admiration she received as if it were a reflection of his own worth. Their first Christmas together, he gave her a framed print of an Audre Lorde quote she'd once mentioned in passing. Their first New Year's, he flew her to New Orleans because she once told him her mother used to sing jazz standards from that city. He learned her favorite tea, her favorite writers, her favorite place to sit in the library. He turned every detail of her life into a gesture, every gesture into evidence that he was paying attention. Amara had never felt chosen like that. And after years of stretching herself thin for students, communities, colleagues, being with Ethan felt like stepping into warmth after too long in the cold. It felt like someone was finally pouring into her cup, anticipating her needs, celebrating her wins. He told her that she didn't rest enough, that she deserved more, that her work was important, but she was important too. He encouraged her to take breaks, to travel, to dream bigger than the confines of her classroom. The first time he said, "You should publish a book," She laughed. The second time, she started outlining chapters. The third time, she believed she could. But beneath the glitter of their romance, something subtle began to shift. At an early dinner with one of Ethan's partners, Amara passionately explained her research on structural inequality. The partner smiled, impressed, but Ethan gently touched her wrist under the table, so light she almost missed it. Afterward, he kissed her forehead and murmured, "You were incredible. Maybe just simplify next time?" They get overwhelmed by dense theory. She brushed it off. A small comment, harmless. Then came another. "You looked amazing tonight, babe. Maybe just a softer lip color next time." The camera lights wash out the bolder shades. Then another. "You don't owe your students everything. You don't have to kill yourself for them." Then another. "You could teach anywhere. Why stay somewhere that doesn't appreciate you? Let me help you find something bigger." He wasn't insulting her. He was uplifting her, supporting her, caring for her, protecting her. Or so it seemed. What Amara didn't see, what she could not yet see, was that every romantic gesture, every compliment, every grand display of devotion carried a tiny hook, a small tug away from her center, a gentle redirecting of her path, a subtle pressure to shape herself into someone who fit seamlessly beside him, someone whose brilliance made him shine brighter, not someone whose independence might cast a shadow over his carefully crafted rise. The world celebrated them as the perfect progressive couple, proof that ambition and justice could coexist. Ethan fed that narrative like oxygen to a flame. And Amara, who had always been the one lifting others up, wasn't used to questioning what it meant when someone lifted her so high. But love that comes on fast, hot, and intoxicating often has a quiet underside, a place where devotion blends with expectation, where admiration disguises ownership, and where the person doing the loving quietly begins to rewrite the rules. Amara didn't know it yet, but the storm wasn't ending. It was only gathering strength. It happened so slowly that Amara couldn't pinpoint the first moment she started shrinking. There was no explosion, no slammed door, no dramatic declaration that she was too much. Instead, the erosion came like water seeping under a foundation, quiet, patient, persistent, undoing everything she once believed was solid. The first shift was subtle enough to seem harmless. They were at a rooftop reception overlooking Manhattan, a fundraiser hosted by one of Ethan's investors. The skyline glowed behind them like a stage set, the kind that made everyone feel more important just by existing near it. Amara was explaining to a circle of donors how education systems often replicate structural inequality. She was animated, confident, speaking from the marrow of her expertise. A man in a tailored navy suit lifted his glass toward Ethan with a polite smile. "Your wife is passionate," he said. "Sharp mind on her." Ethan chuckled lightly, sliding an arm around Amara's waist. "She is, but trust me, she can go on forever. I'll make sure she doesn't lecture you all night." The group laughed. Amara smiled too, though her pulse stuttered. A small comment, she told herself, just Ethan trying to keep things light. But over the next few weeks, the pattern grew clearer. "You know how these people are," Ethan said after one dinner. "They prefer lighter conversations. You don't have to dive that deep every time." Or after a conference event, "They're intimidated when you challenge them. A softer approach might help them hear you better." Or when she recounted a student's breakthrough, "Babe, maybe don't tell that story tonight. It's a little heavy for this crowd." None of it sounded cruel, just guidance, just adjustments, just suggestions meant to help her fit better. But each one placed another brick of doubt on her chest, until speaking in her natural voice felt like stepping into the wrong room. Her wardrobe became the next battlefield. At a gala fitting, Amara reached for a red dress, bold, stunning, the kind of color that reminded her of her mother's Sunday choir robes. Ethan placed a hand over hers. "It's gorgeous, but maybe something more neutral?" "The board prefers subtle elegance." She hesitated. "Red is elegant." "I know," he said with a practiced smile, but it pulls attention. We want you to look like part of the team tonight, not the star. Part of the team, not the star. The words grazed her skin like cold metal. Eventually, she chose a navy gown. Safer, quieter. Ethan kissed her temple. Perfect, understated, professional. Understated, professional, safe, small. It didn't stop there. Her community center reading group began to feel like a point of tension. Ethan never forbade her from going. He was too smart for that, but he sighed every time she mentioned it. A soft exhale followed by, "You must be exhausted. You work so hard. Maybe take a break?" Or, "We have that dinner Wednesday. Can you cancel the class just this once?" Just this once became once a month, then once every 2 months, then not at all. Her students noticed first. "We miss you, Dr. J," Rosa texted. "Everything okay?" Amara typed a response, deleted it, typed again, deleted again. Eventually she settled on, "Just busy. I'll be back soon." She didn't return. And the apartment. Oh, the apartment. Ethan insisted the Brooklyn walk-up was too unsafe, too small, too far from his office. He found them a high-rise in Manhattan with floor-to-ceiling windows and a doorman who nodded respectfully at him and looked suspiciously at her. The rent was 3 times what Amara made, but Ethan covered it cheerfully, saying, "I want you to live somewhere worthy of you." She told herself it was love. She ignored the way her father's voice lingered on the phone, hesitant, worried, whenever she tried to explain the move. The more Ethan gave, the more the world applauded him for being supportive. The more she received, the more she owed. And the more she owed, the quieter she became. The erosion wasn't only external. It infiltrated her thoughts, her habits, her sense of self. When she laughed too loudly at a dinner, she immediately checked Ethan's expression. When she offered an opinion in a room full of executives, she waited for his approval. When she felt a flare of anger at something he said, she swallowed it before it reached her tongue. "He's right," she whispered to herself one night, lying awake in their glass-walled bedroom. "He's helping me. He wants me to succeed." But success for whom? At what cost? And why did the reflection she saw in the window look like a stranger wearing her face? One evening, she found herself staring at an unopened box on the top shelf of her closet, labeled in her father's handwriting, "For when you forget yourself." She almost reached for it, almost lifted it down, almost remembered who she had been before Ethan. But Ethan called her name from the kitchen. "Amara, we're late for the dinner." And the moment evaporated like smoke. She closed the closet door, slipped on a beige dress he'd picked out, and walked toward him with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned the art of disappearing. The storm was growing, and Amara, once a woman who filled rooms with her voice, was now shrinking so subtly that she didn't realize she was already half gone. Leonard Johnson had a way of seeing the truth in people long before they saw it in themselves. It was the gift that made him a legendary professor, a fierce civil rights advocate, and a father whose love was equal parts warmth and warning. And in the months after Amara moved into Ethan's Manhattan apartment, Leonard's voice, usually patient, usually gentle, began carrying an undercurrent of worry she couldn't quite ignore. It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Amara had taken the train to Harlem to visit him, stepping into the apartment that always smelled faintly of old books, lemon oil, and the comfort of things that didn't need to impress anyone. Leonard sat in his armchair, surrounded by stacks of annotated case files and history books. The sunlight fell across the wrinkles around his eyes, lines carved from decades of fighting battles both in the courtroom and in the classroom. "You look tired, baby girl," he said, studying her face the way he used to study students' essays, searching not for errors, but for what they were trying to hide. "I'm fine," she insisted, forcing brightness into her voice. "Just busy. Ethan's schedule is a lot." Leonard hummed, the sound low and knowing. "Busy is one thing, but you look like someone who's been holding her breath for miles." Amara laughed it off, but the comment lingered. Over the next few months, the visits became more tense. Not because of arguments, but because of the words Leonard didn't say. He watched her carefully, always with that quiet, discerning gaze. He asked questions that pierced deeper than she wanted. Are you still teaching that evening class? You've missed 2 of your Sunday readings. Everything okay? When's the last time you wrote something just for yourself? The truth sat heavy in her chest. No, no. She couldn't remember. One evening, Leonard pulled a worn shoebox from his bookshelf and set it on the coffee table between them. Its edges were frayed, the lid bowed from years of being opened and closed. I've been meaning to give this to you, he said. What is it? She asked. He pushed it closer. Something for later, something to open when you forget who you are. Her breath caught. Daddy, what does that mean? Leonard didn't smile, didn't soften it. It means I think you're drifting, and I think he's helping you drift. Ethan? She recoiled as if the name itself could shield her from the truth. He cares about me. He supports me. I didn't say he doesn't care, Leonard replied. But baby, there's a difference between loving someone and shaping them. There's a difference between support and control. And there's a difference between a partner and a man who wants to be seen with the idea of you. Amara stiffened. That's not fair. Maybe not, Leonard said gently. But fairness doesn't change what I see. She wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. A tremor, a grief, a memory. He sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. Do you know why I'm so afraid for you? His voice grew softer, the words weighted with history. Because I've watched this happen before. He didn't have to say her mother's name. It hovered in the air between them anyway, a ghost they both carried. Her mother had been brilliant, sharp-witted, tender-hearted, a singer whose voice could hush a room. She'd loved fiercely, fought fiercely, lived fiercely, until she married a man who preferred women who folded neatly into the corners of his life. A man who prized silence over truth. A man who dimmed the brightest part of her until she no longer recognized her own reflection. By the time illness came for her, there was barely anything left to fight with. Leonard had spent years grieving 2 losses. The woman he loved, and the woman he realized he'd lost long before she took her last breath. I watched your mama shrink, he whispered, piece by piece, dream by dream, story by story. I promised myself I'd never let that happen to you. Amara swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. I'm not shrinking, aren't you? He asked softly. You don't teach anymore. You left your community center. You used to talk about your students for hours. Now you barely mention them. You used to have opinions that lit up entire rooms. Now you hesitate. And sweetheart, I've never seen you hesitate a day in your life. Her throat tightened. She wanted to argue, wanted to defend Ethan, defend herself, defend the choices she'd made. But the words tangled in her chest because the truth, sharp and unwelcome, was already taking shape. She was hesitating. She was dimming. She was bending herself into shapes she didn't recognize. Leonard leaned forward, placing a hand over hers. His skin was cool, his grip steady. I don't need you to leave him. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just asking you to stay awake. To notice when someone asks you to make yourself smaller. To remember that the world has already asked that of you 1,000 times, and you fought every one of those battles. Don't lose that fight now. Amara blinked back tears. He's not a bad man. Leonard shook his head. Sweetheart, you don't need a bad man to lose yourself. All it takes is one who needs to feel big. The words lodged deep, heavy and immovable. Before she left that night, Leonard pressed the shoebox into her hands. Promise me you'll open this when the noise gets too loud. She nodded, though she didn't understand. Not yet. As she stepped out into the Harlem night, cold, wide, alive, she could feel the warning in her father's gaze burning into her back. The city glowed around her, vibrant and unforgiving. And somewhere in the distance, she heard sirens, laughter, arguments, music, New York's endless symphony of becoming and undoing. She didn't know it then, but she was walking the knife edge between the life her father raised her to live and the life Ethan was quietly, skillfully asking her to surrender. In the shoebox, silent, patient, waiting on her closet shelf, held the truth she would one day need to save herself. The morning her world split in two began like any other lie of a peaceful day. The sky over Manhattan was a pale, forgiving blue. Steam curled from street grates. Taxis honked without urgency. In the apartment high above it all, the coffee machine hummed, and Amara stood barefoot in the kitchen, scrolling through her lecture notes for a guest talk she'd agreed to give at a nonprofit later that week. Leonard had texted her a heart last night after their call. "Proud of you, Professor," he'd written. She'd gone to sleep feeling held. Ethan walked in, already dressed for war. Navy suit, white shirt, tie knotted with algorithmic precision. He kissed her cheek in passing, eyes on his phone, on the calendar, on the day ahead. "Big one today," he said, reaching for his mug. "Don't forget to watch. 12 o'clock. National segment, prime slot." She smiled faintly. "You nervous?" He gave a half shrug, the humble version of pride. "It's just another interview. But yeah, this one matters." The coffee had just finished dripping when her phone rang. Leonard's neighbor, Mr. Jefferson, flashing across the screen. Odd. He never called. A small chill flickered through her. "Hey, Mr. Jefferson," she answered lightly. "Everything okay?" His voice came through fractured and frantic. "Baby, it's your daddy. He collapsed. Paramedics here now. He's not waking up. They're taking him to Harlem Hospital. You need to come now. Now!" The mug slipped from her hand and shattered on the tile, coffee exploding across the floor like spilled blood. For a heartbeat, the world went silent. Then sound crashed back in. Ethan's voice, the city, her own ragged breathing. "What happened?" Ethan demanded, grabbing a towel. "It's my father," she gasped. He collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital. I have to go." Ethan blinked, checked his watch without thinking. The movement was so automatic she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching his face, searching for panic that should have matched hers. "Now?" he asked. "They're taking him now?" "Yes, now," she snapped, already moving, grabbing her bag, her keys, her coat. "Ethan, he could be dying." He hesitated. Just a second, just the length of a breath. But the pause carved itself into her memory like a scar. "My car's downstairs," he began, logic kicking in. "We'll never get back in time if I go with you. I have the car picking me up at 9:30 for the studio." They blocked off the segment to talk about the new fund. "It's live, Amara. I can't just—" She turned on him, eyes wide with disbelief. "My father is in an ambulance." "I know," he said quickly, voice soothing, hands raised as if calming a skittish animal. "I know. Listen to me. You go now. Take a cab, whatever's fastest. I'll meet you after the interview. It's a couple of hours, tops. He's tough. He's probably going to give the doctors a lecture." She stared at him, time stretching, the air thick as glass between them. "You're not coming with me." "Amara, this is my career," he said quietly. "This interview could decide everything for the fund, for us, for the work we do. Your father wouldn't want you to ruin that. You know he wouldn't." The worst part was that he said it like he believed it. Like he truly believed that Leonard, who had spent his life fighting systems of indifference, would tell his daughter to attend to optics while his own heart betrayed him. Something in her faltered. The years of erosion, of second-guessing herself, of bending to the shape of his world, rose like a tide. She whispered. "Go," he urged. "Be with him. Call me the second you know anything. I'll come as soon as I'm done. I promise." Promises, she would realize later, are weakest when made to ease guilt instead of to honor truth. She ran, down the elevator, onto the street, into the harsh light of an ordinary morning that had no idea it had become a dividing line in her life. The cab ride to Harlem was a blur of red lights and blurred buildings. She clutched her phone so tightly her knuckles ached. Every siren they passed felt like it might be his. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights were too bright, the air too cold. A nurse led her down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and endings. When they parted the curtain around his bed, Leonard looked smaller than she'd ever seen him. Tubes snaked from his arms. A monitor beeped steadily, indifferent to her horror. His chest rose and fell with effort, each breath a battle. "Daddy," she choked, grabbing his hand. It was warm, thank God, still warm. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then finding her. Even then, even on the edge, his gaze sharpened when it landed on her face. "There she is," he rasped through the oxygen mask. "My professor." She laughed once, broken. "Don't talk, Daddy. Save your strength." He squeezed her fingers weakly. "No time to save anything," he whispered. "Listen." Of all the lectures he had ever given, this would be the shortest and the most important. "You are not a prop in nobody's story," he murmured. "You hear me? Not his, not this city's, not this country's. You are your own." Tears blurred her vision. "Daddy, please, don't disappear," he forced out, eyes burning into hers. "I watched your mama fade. I watched her shrink herself to fit a man's idea of her. I won't watch that happen to you. I can't." His grip tightened, surprising her with the strength that still lived in his failing body. "Promise me, when you feel yourself getting small, you stop, you turn around, you run." "I promise," she sobbed. "I promise, I promise." He smiled faintly, satisfied. His eyes drifted to the ceiling. For a moment, he looked almost peaceful. "Good. Then I can rest." She didn't understand then. Not fully. Not until the monitor stuttered. Not until a nurse rushed in. Not until the room filled with people speaking in urgent, clipped phrases that somehow never used the word death, even as it swept in, quiet and absolute. When it was over, they left her alone with him. The worst silence of her life. She laid her forehead on his chest and wept, body shaking, his hands still in hers, already cooling. All the things she hadn't said that week, that month, that year, piled up like rubble inside her. She should have visited more, called more, fought harder when he warned her. Opened the box. Hours later, numb, emptied, she found herself sitting in the family waiting room, staring at a muted television mounted in the corner. The sound was off, but she didn't need it. She knew that studio, knew that suit, knew that smile. Ethan filled the screen, poised and articulate, seated opposite a famous anchor. The chyron at the bottom read, "Ethan Clark, reimagining education through tech." The camera cut to a clip of under-resourced classrooms, the very kind she'd spent her life in. The anchor's mouth moved. The caption of his question appeared on the screen. "I understand you and your wife recently suffered a personal loss, and yet you didn't cancel today's interview. Why?" Ethan's expression shifted into something grave and noble. He looked down for a second, then up again with practiced vulnerability. Even in silence, Amara could hear the script. "My father-in-law was an extraordinary man," he said. The caption transcribed it perfectly. "He believed in education, in resilience, in pushing through hardship. Canceling this interview would have dishonored him. I'm here because of him. We keep going, even when it hurts." Amara stared, her grief curdling into something jagged. He had folded her father's death into his story as seamlessly as he folded a pocket square. Turned the man who warned her not to disappear into a plot point about his own perseverance. Even now, hours, maybe minutes, after Leonard's heart had stopped beating, Ethan was using his name to appear stronger, braver, more dedicated. On the screen, he placed a hand over his heart in a gesture of sincerity she recognized from countless rehearsed mirror sessions. The anchor nodded, clearly moved. The audience watching at home would be too. They'd see a devoted husband, a grieving yet steadfast son-in-law, a man so committed to his mission that not even tragedy could slow him down. Amara watched herself appear in a photo over his shoulder, her hand in his, her smile bright but distant. The caption beneath it, Ethan Clarke and wife, Dr. Amara Johnson, champions of change. In the harsh hospital light, with her father's body still lying in a room down the hall, something inside her cracked all the way through. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was a clean, devastating fracture. This is who he is, the newly broken voice inside her whispered. This is who you've been disappearing for. Grief flooded her again, but now it was braided with fury. At Ethan, at herself, at every quiet moment she'd chosen his comfort over her own instincts. At every time she'd let him translate her life into language that made him look good. Sitting there, in a plastic chair bolted to the floor of a hospital waiting room, Amara realized that Leonard hadn't just died. A version of her had too. And the promise she made at his bedside, the one she thought was about some distant, hypothetical danger, suddenly felt immediate, urgent, non-negotiable. She could keep shrinking until there was nothing left, or she could break and begin again. 3 months after Leonard's funeral, winter tightened its grip on New York. Sharp winds carving through the avenues, snow piled in gray heaps along the curbs, the whole city exhaling clouds. Amara had returned to work in scattered pieces. She taught 2 classes a week, graded papers late into the night, visited her father's apartment only once before locking the door again, unable to breathe inside the ghost of a life that wasn't coming back. She didn't cry much anymore. Grief had shifted its weight, less a stab, more a stone she carried quietly under her ribs. Ethan, meanwhile, moved with the same relentless forward momentum that had always defined him. The fundraising cycle for his new education tech fund had reached its climax. Tonight was the pinnacle, the Future of Innovation Gala, where politicians, philanthropists, and billionaires would assess him with their polite smiles and razor-sharp judgments. A night that could seal his reputation as the next great voice in social impact, or unravel it. Which is why, as the car descended into the underground driveway of the Metropolis Grand Hotel, Ethan was already vibrating with tension. He checked his watch, checked his reflection in the tinted window, checked his phone. Not once did he check Amara's face. She sat beside him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her pulse fluttering in her throat. She wore a dress he had chosen, deep emerald silk, elegant and quiet, the kind of dress that blended rather than announced. The fabric felt cold against her skin. "Remember," Ethan said, smoothing his cufflink without looking at her, "the Clarke Foundation board will be at our table. Senator Whitmore, too. His endorsement is critical." His voice softened, artificially gentle. "Just follow my lead tonight. Stay close. And please, Amara." He inhaled sharply, jaw tightening as if bracing for impact. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." There it was again, a variation of the warning she'd been hearing for months. Not an order, but a reminder wrapped in concern. Amara's stomach nodded. "Harder for who?" she asked quietly. He didn't answer. The car door opened to a burst of camera flashes. A valet ushered them onto the red carpet, guiding them toward the golden entrance of the ballroom. Inside, sweeping staircases framed by marble pillars gave way to a chandelier that looked less like lighting and more like a captured sun. Waiters in ivory tuxedos glided between tables. The air smelled of wealth, aged wine, expensive perfume, polished brass. Ethan straightened. Public Ethan. Perfect Ethan. The man who had been made for these rooms. To Amara, everything felt louder, too sharp, too bright, a pressure building behind her sternum, like an instinct trying to warn her. "Ethan," someone called. A tech CEO in a silver suit clasped his shoulder. "Tonight's your night, the Education Impact Award. Hell of an achievement, my friend." Ethan laughed, charming, polished. "Appreciated. Still a lot of work ahead." The CEO's wife turned to Amara. "And you must be his consultant or PR?" She extended a hand, blinking with polite confusion. Amara forced a smile. I'm his wife. Oh! The woman's voice lifted an octave. Impressive. Another harmless misunderstanding, another micro cut. But tonight, the cuts felt deeper, closer to bone. They reached their table, 12 seats arranged beneath the chandelier's shimmering halo. Senator Whitmore's wife gave Amara a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I loved your comments on the segment last month, she said, even though Amara had said nothing at all on television. The senator himself leaned in toward Ethan. You'll want to keep tonight smooth, he said quietly. Donors love you, but they still don't know what to make of her background. Don't let things get too academic. The pause before her hit like a blow. Ethan gave a tight smile, as if agreeing with or dismissing the comment. It was impossible to tell where his loyalty leaned. Dinner began. Plates appeared like magic, artfully arranged scallops, a truffle risotto, desserts dusted with gold leaf. Conversations swirled about investments, mergers, innovation, the future of impact. But at table 7, the pressure cooked slowly, silently. At one point, a donor leaned toward Amara politely. So, Dr. Johnson, what do you teach again? Sociology, she answered, specifically about structures that create inequality. The donor chuckled. Ambitious. You know, Ethan's told us you're brilliant, but be careful. Rooms like these don't respond well to critiques. He winked as if offering sage advice. Ethan smiled, placing a steadying hand on her knee under the table. She knows how to read a room. The implication, spoken softly but unmistakably, chilled her. She swallowed her reply, the one that burned hot and sharp on her tongue. Because that was what Ethan needed. That was what everyone expected. The academic wife. Polished, controlled, decorative. Then the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the start of the speeches. A man in a tuxedo took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Education Impact Award honoree, Ethan Clark. Applause swelled. Ethan kissed her cheek, quick, perfunctory, and rose from his chair. Flashbulbs popped as he crossed the ballroom, his silhouette cutting a confident line across the gold-lit stage. Amara watched him, heart tight, breath shallow. He began his speech. Smooth, powerful, moving in all the ways a camera loved. He spoke of innovation, access, opportunity. He spoke of the communities that shaped us and the educators who showed us the way. Then his voice grew solemn, eyes lowering just enough to seem vulnerable. And 3 months ago, he said, my wife and I experienced a heartbreaking loss. Her father, a man of great conviction and vision, passed away suddenly. A man who believed in education more fiercely than anyone I knew. His death strengthened my resolve. Tonight, I dedicate this award to him. Gasps of sympathy rippled through the crowd. Amara's breath caught, sharp, painful, because he said it beautifully, respectfully, perfectly, but also completely for himself. Leonard's name had become a tool, a frame for Ethan's resilience, a note in his anthem. She felt heat creep up her neck, a tremor in her hands, a pulse of anger so fierce it almost frightened her. Not here, she told herself. Not now. But the storm inside her was no longer a quiet thing. The applause thundered. Ethan bowed his head modestly, accepting praise that didn't belong to him. As he returned to the table, smiling, glowing with triumph, she realized she couldn't breathe. The chandelier seemed to tremble overhead, scattering shards of gold across the room. Conversations resumed. Wine glasses clinked. Laughter rippled. But for Amara, something had shifted irrevocably. This room, this man, this life, none of it fit anymore. Ethan sat down, hand returning to her knee, ownership disguised as affection. He leaned in. You okay? He whispered, all polite concern. A lie disguised as love. And in that moment, under a chandelier that hummed with privilege, surrounded by applause that wasn't hers, Amara felt it. The breaking point wasn't coming. It had already arrived. Amara didn't walk toward the restroom like Ethan ordered. She walked away from him, away from the ballroom, away from the heat of 100 scrutinizing glances. Her heels clicked against the marble as she moved down the corridor, lined with portraits of men who seemed to be carved from the same stone. Pale faces, stern eyes, names etched in brass beneath them. Founders, benefactors, visionaries, the plaques proclaimed. Men whose power had never required permission. The further she got from the music and laughter, the louder her heartbeat became. Ethan's words still rang in her ears, each one a bruise. You made me look weak. You're leaning into a stereotype. I built this brand. You don't get to wreck it because you miss your dad. She hadn't cried in front of him, not this time. Her eyes had burned, but the tears stayed where they were, turning to something harder, something sharper. She turned a corner, breathing raggedly, and found herself in front of a heavy wooden door, half open to a room lit with softer, golden light. A small brass plaque beside it read, Archive and Reading Room, Clark Foundation Collections. Without thinking, she slipped inside. The noise of the gala muffled instantly, as if someone had closed a lid over the world. The room smelled like old paper and polished wood, lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves. Soft lamps glowed over leather armchairs. This was not a room for donors to parade through. This was a room for people who still believed in quiet things. For a moment, Amara just stood there, chest heaving, letting the silence cradle her frayed nerves. Away from the chandeliers and champagne, she could almost breathe again. Almost. Her gaze drifted over the shelves, the neat plaques marking different collections. Education policy, economic mobility, civil rights history. At the far end of the room, an alcove caught her eye. A small sign hung above a section of shelves, white letters on black. The Leonard Johnson Collection. For a second, she thought her grief had finally made her hallucinate. She moved closer, heart pounding in her ears. There it was again, clearer this time, carved into the wood. The Leonard Johnson Collection, donated in honor of community educators and freedom workers. She reached out and touched the engraved letters with trembling fingers. On the shelves beneath were familiar spines, frayed, underlined, their covers softened by decades of use. The Fire Next Time, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Black Reconstruction in America, dog-eared copies of case law anthologies, spiral notebooks with carefully written labels in his unmistakable capital letters, Harlem Renter Rights Workshop, syllabus, History of Disobedience, her father's books, his handwriting, his life's work, quietly resting in the belly of the very institution that had just used his death as a PR moment. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. Daddy, she whispered, what did you do? He gave us everything, a voice said behind her, soft but steady, and insisted we keep it where people could actually touch it. Amara spun around too fast, nearly stumbling. An older white woman stood a few feet away, holding a slim folder in one hand. Her hair was silver, cut close, her dress simple and dark, a string of pearls resting at her throat. She didn't look like the glittering donors in the ballroom. She looked grounded, observant, dangerous in a way that came from knowing exactly who she was. I'm sorry, Amara said automatically, wiping at the corner of her eye. I didn't realize this room was empty, the woman finished gently. It usually is. She stepped closer, studying Amara with eyes that missed very little. You're Leonard's daughter, Amara swallowed. Yes, I'm Amara, the woman said, nodding. I know, I've seen you in photos. I'm Diane Whitmore. I chair the foundation board. She gave a small, wry smile. And I have been trying very hard not to cause a scene by slapping sense into half the men in that ballroom tonight. Amara stared, caught between disbelief and relief. You knew my father? Diane's gaze softened. Knew of him for years. Met him twice. He terrified me in the best possible way. Your father walked into rooms full of powerful people and behaved as if power and truth were the same thing. They didn't know what to do with him. "That sounds like him," Amara murmured, her throat tight. "When he called about the collection," Diane continued, "he was adamant. His books, his notes, his case files. He wanted them housed here, accessible to students, organizers, fellows, not buried in some Ivy League archive where only the privileged could read them." She set the folder down and reached for one of the books on the shelf, a worn copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He said, "If you're going to name scholarships after rich men, at least let my books sit in the same building." Amara let out a shaky laugh. "He told me he was donating some things. He didn't say it was all this. He wanted to surprise you." Diane opened the front cover and turned it toward Amara. "He also wanted you to see this." On the inside page, in Leonard's familiar blue ink, was a dedication. The letters wobbled slightly, like his hand had been unsteady, but the words were clear. For the ones who were told, in ways loud and quiet, that they did not belong in rooms like this. You do. You always did. Your voice is not decoration. It is disruption. And disruption is how freedom begins. Leonard Johnson. Amara's vision blurred. She blinked hard, tears spilling anyway. She pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle the sob building in her chest. Diane didn't reach out to touch her, didn't rush to soothe. She just stood there, present, bearing witness. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Amara whispered when she could finally speak. "Why didn't Ethan?" The name broke in her mouth. Diane held her gaze for a long, quiet moment. "Because a man who understands what your father really stood for could never use him the way Ethan did on that stage tonight. Not without choking on his own words." The bluntness sliced something open. Amara swallowed against the ache. "You saw it," she said. "Out there." "I saw everything," Diane replied. "The way you flinched when he mentioned Leonard. The way he kept tightening his grip on your story until it fit in his narrative. The way you almost disappeared during dinner." She tilted her head. "I also saw you refuse to fully vanish. That's why you're here and he's out there." Amara leaned back against the shelf, the wood solid at her spine. "He keeps telling me I'm making things harder," she said hoarsely, "that I don't understand how this world works, that if I would just stay polished, he could do more good, that my anger is a liability." Diane nodded slowly. "I was married to a man like that once. Brilliant, charming, adored. He loved me most when I was convenient, when my opinions made him look enlightened but never uncomfortable, when my presence helped him look progressive, evolved, good. The moment my truth threatened his image, he stopped hearing me and started managing me." Amara's breath hitched. "How did you leave?" "The same way you got here," Diane said. "One decision at a time, one hallway walk at a time, one moment of choosing myself in private until I could choose myself in public." She smiled, but there was no nostalgia in it, only clarity. "I lost friends. I lost status. I lost invitations to rooms with chandeliers like planets. Then I found something better. A life that didn't require me to amputate pieces of my soul." Silence stretched between them, thick and humming. Amara looked around at the shelves, at the quiet power of Leonard's books resting in this curated, expensive archive. Her father had placed his life's work in the very heart of the world that commodified suffering and called it philanthropy. Not because he believed in their goodness, but because he believed in possibility. "You know what haunts men like Ethan?" Diane asked softly. "Women who remember they were whole before they were chosen." The words landed like a bell ringing deep in Amara's chest. She thought of her classroom in Brooklyn, of Rosa and Malik, and the laughter that used to fill cramped rooms, of her post-it wall of quotes, of Sunday calls with Leonard, of the shoebox on the closet shelf, waiting. "You're standing at a fork, Amara," Diane said. "One path is the slow death your father begged you to avoid. The other is messy, painful, terrifying, and honest." She picked up another book from the Leonard Johnson collection and placed it in Amara's hands. Only you can choose which story you're willing to live. Amara ran her fingers over the cracked spine. She could almost feel her father's touch lingering in the grooves. His voice rose up in her memory, rough and tender. Don't disappear. When you feel yourself getting small, you stop, you turn around, you run. In the archive's warm, quiet light, with her father's words in one hand and Diane's truth in the other, the shape of her next move began to form. Not fully, not comfortably, but unmistakably. She straightened slowly, tears drying on her cheeks, a different kind of wetness gathering in her eyes, something fiercer than grief. When she spoke, her voice was low, but it did not tremble. "I'm done letting him write my father into a story," she said. "I'm done letting him write me into it, too." Diane's lips curved, small and proud. "Good," she replied. "Then I suggest we go back into that ballroom." Amara clutched the book to her chest like a shield, like a compass, like a promise. For the first time in months, she felt something she thought she'd buried with Leonard. Not peace, not joy, certainty. Amara didn't feel herself walking. She felt herself rising. Rising out of months of silence. Rising out of the version of herself Ethan had sculpted. Rising into the woman her father had raised. The ballroom doors loomed ahead, golden, heavy, pulsing with the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Diane walked one pace behind her, steady as a lighthouse in a storm. Inside, the atmosphere was unchanged, opulent, buzzing, self-assured. Ethan sat at table 7, surrounded by donors, singing his praises, unaware that the ground beneath him had already shifted. But when he looked up and saw Amara striding toward the stage, a frown cut across his perfect composure. "Amara?" he mouthed. She didn't stop, didn't answer, didn't break stride. The MC was halfway through introducing the closing remarks when Amara reached the steps. The woman at the podium, startled, stepped aside instinctively. Amara's hand closed around the microphone with a calmness she did not feel. At first, the room barely noticed. Just another elegant woman adjusting something on stage. Then Ethan surged to his feet, and the murmurs exploded like sparks skipping across dry leaves. "Good evening," Amara said, her voice steady, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "My name is Dr. Amara Johnson." Silence spread in a slow, rippling wave, softening the clatter of silverware, flattening the hum of conversations. Hundreds of faces turned toward her. The chandeliers glittered overhead like watchful moons. "I know most of you don't know me," she continued, "even though some of you have spoken about me tonight as if you did." Ethan took a step toward the stage. Diane placed a hand on his arm, stopping him cold. Their eyes locked. Ethan froze. Amara went on. "Tonight my husband spoke beautifully about my father. He spoke so beautifully that many of you applauded him, thanked him, admired him." Her eyes drifted toward Ethan, just for a breath, before lifting again to the audience. "But what he didn't tell you," she said softly, "what he chose not to say, was that when my father collapsed 3 months ago, he didn't go with me to the hospital." A gasp rippled across the room. He had a live interview that was more important. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." Amara's voice did not waver. "And when my father died, he used that moment, my grief, to frame his own resilience, to strengthen his brand, to show the world that he could push forward in tragedy." Ethan's face drained of color. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "My father's name was Leonard Johnson," she said, as if reclaiming something with each syllable. "He was not an anecdote. He was not a bullet point in a speech. He was a man who taught black and brown students their worth in a world determined to convince them otherwise." Her breath hitched, but she didn't stop. "He gave this foundation his entire library, books he spent 40 years annotating, not to elevate Ethan, not to elevate me, but to elevate truth." The audience was rapt. No phones rang, no glasses clinked. It was the kind of silence that meant every single person was leaning toward her story. My father believed that the most dangerous thing a person can do, she continued, is shrink themselves to make powerful people comfortable. Her gaze swept the room, catching faces that softened, tightened, broke. And that is exactly what I have been doing. For months, I have made myself quieter, smaller, gentler, simpler, so that I could be the kind of wife who fits neatly into rooms like this. The chandelier lights caught the shimmer of tears on her cheek. She didn't wipe them away. I let myself become a prop, a symbol, a curated accessory to someone else's narrative. Her next inhale came shakily, but when she exhaled, her voice rang out with the clarity of a bell. Well, that ends tonight. A ripple of something, shock, awe, release, moved through the audience. I am my father's daughter, she said, placing a hand over her chest. I am a scholar, a teacher, a woman who has spent her life helping others discover their voice. And somehow I forgot my own. She paused. The silence leaned closer. So hear me now. I will not be dimmed to make anyone shine. I will not be quiet so someone else can appear powerful. I will not disappear so a man can feel whole. Her eyes locked onto Ethan. He flinched. Just once, but everyone saw. I am done letting people mistake my silence for agreement, my absence for obedience, my love for subservience. Her voice deepened, softer but infinitely stronger. And if you've ever felt invisible in a room like this, if you've ever swallowed your truth to protect someone else's ego, understand this. You do not owe anyone your disappearance. The ballroom erupted, not into applause, but into breath held tight, like the moment before a dam breaks. Amara stepped back from the microphone. My father taught me that dignity is self-authored. And tonight, I'm writing mine. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then Diane rose, slowly, deliberately. Her hands came together in applause that echoed like a first clap of thunder. A young founder stood next. Then a woman at the far table. Then a man near the bar. And then the room erupted. The applause swelled, thunderous and rolling, climbing the walls, shaking the chandeliers. People stood in waves, more and more, until nearly every person in the ballroom was on their feet, clapping for a woman who had just rewritten the language of power in a room built to silence her. Amara didn't bow, didn't smile. She simply breathed, deep, steady, free. And as she stepped off the stage, passing Ethan without a single glance, she felt the truth settle into her bones. She had stopped disappearing. The world had finally seen her. By the time Amara stepped out of the hotel and into the cold Manhattan night, applause still trembled in her bones. The air hit her like ice water, shocking and clean. Snow flurries swirled under the streetlights, gathering on the sidewalk like the city itself had paused to witness the moment she stepped back into her own life. For a few heartbeats, she simply stood there, breathing, alive, raw, unarmored, and strangely unafraid. Then her phone began vibrating in her clutch. Again, and again, and again. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She walked away from the entrance before she dared open it. When she finally did, the screen lit up like a frantic confession. 15 missed calls. Ethan. 11 messages. Ethan. 3 voicemails. Ethan. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from clarity. She didn't listen. She didn't respond. She simply turned the device face down in her palm, as if dimming a light she'd been blinded by for far too long. The next morning, the storm had already begun. Amara woke in her friend Yvette's tiny Crown Heights apartment, on a futon with lumps older than the building itself, her head pounding, throat dry, heart strangely steady. Yvette had insisted on taking her in the moment Amara appeared at her door at 1 a.m., mascara streaked, dress wrinkled, clutching a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed like a life raft. She didn't ask questions. She just wrapped Amara in a blanket, put tea in her hands, and sat beside her in quiet solidarity. Now sunlight crept through the curtains, and Amara reached for her phone. It buzzed constantly. This time, she looked. Twitter, her face everywhere, her name trending, clips of her speech cut into dramatic edits, music swelling, captions flashing. This is what courage looks like. Wife exposes husband's manipulation at live gala. Dr. Amara Johnson ends the silence. Instagram, edits, duets, reaction videos, people crying, people cheering. One creator, this woman just broke generational silence in a room built to bury her voice. TikTok, millions of views, millions, and rising. The comment sections were oceans of emotion. Women confessing stories they'd never spoken aloud. Men apologizing for partners they'd hurt. Young girls typing, "I want to be her when I grow up." But there was darkness too. She just destroyed her husband's career for attention. A bitter black woman making everything about race. Ungrateful, unstable, typical. The vitriol slithered between the praise like poison. Still, Amara didn't look away. She'd lived in silence long enough. By noon, Ethan found her. He didn't come in person. He sent an email. Subject, "We need to talk." Body, "You humiliated me. You threw away everything we built. I can fix this, but only if you come home now. We need to issue a joint statement. Don't make this worse." Beneath it, voicemail transcription. "You owe me a conversation, Amara. After everything I've done for you." She deleted it, not out of anger, out of peace. Then another email arrived. Subject, "Legal notice." From Clark and Williams LLP. Her stomach flipped. She clicked. A neatly worded message. Ethan planned to seek control of shared assets. He argued she'd caused reputational damage. He hinted she might be liable for breach of prenuptial terms. Her hands went cold. Yvette swore loudly from the kitchen when Amara read it aloud. "Girl, you better get a lawyer. Today." That afternoon, Amara walked into a legal aid office downtown. A place with flickering lights, scuffed floors, and people who smelled like real life rather than money. A young attorney named Isaiah looked over her prenup, eyebrows arching higher with each page. "Jesus," he muttered, "did you sign this willingly, or did he hypnotize you?" "It seemed fair at the time," she said quietly. "It's not," Isaiah replied, "but don't panic. There are leverage points. And what he did last night? Public, documented. That matters." She nodded, though fear gnawed at her ribs. She had always been self-sufficient, but Manhattan rents were not forgiving. Her teaching salary, part-time at the moment, would barely cover groceries, let alone housing. And Ethan had been covering everything for months. Then Isaiah looked her square in the eyes. "You stood up to a room that was built to devour people like us," he said. "Trust me, this part, the paperwork, we can handle that." She exhaled slowly. "Okay, first step," he said, sliding a packet toward her, "is detangling your finances. Second is securing housing." Housing. The word hit her like a punch. She had left with nothing but a dress, a book, and a phone. Everything else, the clothes, the dishes, the furniture, her passport, was in Ethan's apartment. And even if she could get it back, she wouldn't go there. Not again. Not after last night. So she started scrolling apartment listings on her phone while Isaiah explained next steps. Each listing felt like a blow. $2,500 for a studio with a broken radiator. $2,900 for something above a nightclub. $2,300 for a place with partial walls that looked more like a closet. Her bank account, not enough. Not yet. But she would make it enough. By nightfall, her viral speech had climbed to the front page of every platform. Celebrities reposted it. Activists dissected it. Wives shared it in group chats titled, "We Need to Talk." A journalist emailed requesting an interview. 2 nonprofits asked if she could speak at upcoming conferences. Opportunities bloomed where her silence had once lived. And yet, Reality pressed against her temples like a vice. She was homeless for the moment, in legal limbo. Half the internet adored her. Half the internet wanted her destroyed. And Ethan, who had once loved her with performative warmth, was now weaponizing every advantage he'd ever collected. But that night, as she lay again on Yvette's lumpy futon, the weight of uncertainty wrapped around her. One thought rose through the chaos with the clarity of sunrise. This is the cost of choosing myself, and it is worth every trembling breath. She closed her eyes. She didn't know where she would live. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know how long the world's attention would last. But she knew this. She was no longer disappearing. And that Amara's new classroom didn't have chandeliers. It didn't even have matching chairs. It was a basement-level, multi-purpose room in a public library in Brooklyn. The kind of room that smelled faintly of whiteboard markers and old carpet, where the fluorescent lights flickered like they were fighting to stay awake. There were cracks in the ceiling tiles. The heat clanked through the vents like someone banging pipes with a wrench. Half the tables wobbled. The other half were covered in carved initials from students who had passed through over the decades. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't prestigious. It wasn't the kind of place anyone photographed for press releases. And yet, when Amara unlocked the door for her first community storytelling workshop, her heart fluttered with something she hadn't felt in months: belonging. The library had offered her the room for free on Saturday mornings, after seeing her viral speech and hearing from patrons who said, "We need her voice here." The dean from her old college had encouraged her to take it. "Start something," she'd said. "Build what your father believed in." So she did. By 10 o'clock, people began trickling in. Not donors, not influencers, not people in suits in polished shoes. A 50-year-old Jamaican grandmother named Claudette, who carried a notebook filled with poems she had never read aloud. A formerly incarcerated man, Rico, who shifted nervously as he chose a seat near the back. A 17-year-old kid named Zane, hoodie pulled tight, eyes sharp with stories he didn't yet trust himself to tell. A nurse on the night shift, an Uber driver, a mother of 3, an immigrant who spoke in broken English but perfect emotion, a man who'd lost his job during the pandemic and hadn't spoken above a whisper since. 15 strangers, 15 lives, 15 untold histories waiting for permission to matter. "Welcome," Amara said, standing at the front. She still felt bruised, still felt the ache of uncertainty in her bones, still didn't know where she would live next month, how the legal battle would end, how her finances would stabilize. But in this room, those fears quieted. In this room, her voice returned. "We're here," she said gently, "to tell the truths that don't fit in ballrooms." Heads lifted, eyes softened. Something warm moved through the space, settling into the cracks. She began with a simple exercise. Write one sentence about a moment in your life when you felt invisible. Pens scratched slowly across paper. Breaths caught. No one looked up. Then Rico raised his hand, hesitant, almost trembling. Can I read mine?" Amara nodded. He stood, unfolded a page and read, voice rough and low. "When I got out, I walked into Walmart to buy toothpaste and nobody looked at me. Not once. And it messed me up because for 3 years straight, every guard watched every single thing I did. And now, nothing. Like I was air." The room went still. Amara stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "You weren't air. You were free, and you were worth seeing." When Rico sat down, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Next, Claudette read a poem about losing her husband and finding pieces of him in the smallest, most ordinary sounds. A kettle boiling, keys jingling, church bells on Sundays. Her voice cracked halfway through. The entire class murmured, "Take your time," like a chorus of healing. Zane didn't speak until the end of class. He approached Amara while she packed her bag. "Miss," he murmured, eyes down, "I wrote this." He handed her a page filled with jagged handwriting, a story about growing up between cultures, between identities, between expectations he had never agreed to. She read it once, then again, then looked at him. "You're a writer," she said simply. His face flushed, embarrassed, hopeful, terrified. "You really think so?" "I know so." He blinked fast, nodding. "Okay." A pause. "Okay." The next Saturday, 20 people came. Then 25. Then 30. The room was always full. People stood in the doorway. The library staff started bringing extra chairs. News spread, not through headlines or viral clips, but through whispers, text messages, barbershop conversations, church pews, corner stores. "There's a woman teaching us to tell our stories. She listens. She sees us. She makes us believe we matter." One morning, the librarian pulled Amara aside. "People are coming in asking for your workshop by name," she said. "You're building something here." Amara smiled quietly, a little shocked every time someone said it. Something inside her, something she thought she'd lost during those months with Ethan, began stitching itself back together, one story at a time. But life outside the classroom was not forgiving. Her bank account was a battlefield. Legal fees piled up. Her teaching hours were still part-time. Rental applications asked for proof of income she did not yet have. Some landlords saw clips of her speech and muttered things like, "We don't need that kind of drama here." Sometimes she cried in the shower so Yvette wouldn't hear. Sometimes she woke at 3 a.m., heart racing, convinced she had ruined her life. Sometimes she looked at photos of what her life used to be. Spacious apartment, marble countertops, curated stability, and felt a flash of fear. But every Saturday, she stepped into that flickering basement room and remembered. She hadn't ruined her life. She had reclaimed it. Her students' stories reminded her how many people had been made small by the machinery of wealth, power, and expectation. And each week, she watched them grow larger again. One morning, Rico stayed late to talk. "Miss," he said, voice thick, "that thing you said last week, about us not being broken?" "Yes." "I ain't stopped thinking about it." He took a shaky breath. "Made me realize I want to see my daughter again. Haven't seen her in years. But maybe I'm allowed to try." Emotion crawled up Amara's chest. "You are," she whispered. "You always were." That night, as she left the library, snowflakes drifting onto her coat, she paused on the sidewalk and looked back at the building. Old brick, chipped paint, warm light spilling from the windows. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She felt the weight of her father's absence and the warmth of his presence at the same time. His books were sitting in a foundation archive miles away, but his voice was here. In every revolutionary truth spoken aloud, in every person who rediscovered their power, in every corner of the room where silence turned into storytelling. Rebuilding didn't feel like triumph. It felt like stitching a torn fabric with trembling hands. Slow, unsteady, but real. And in those dimly lit classrooms without chandeliers, Amara Johnson began to shine brighter than she ever had in rooms built to silence her. The ripple didn't begin with the speech going viral. It began the moment someone, no one knows who, posted a shaky phone recording of Amara stepping away from the microphone with tears on her face and steel in her spine. The clip was only 34 seconds long, but it spread like wildfire through timelines and group chats and inboxes. The kind of moment that ignites a collective chord inside people who've been quietly enduring the same invisible wounds. Every hour, the view count doubled. Every hour, more voices poured into the comment sections. Women, men, teenagers, elders, confessing things they'd never said aloud, typing with trembling hands. "I stayed silent for 10 years. I'm done. She said what I've been too afraid to admit. This healed something I didn't know was broken. I watched this 15 times. It's like she read my diary. I left tonight. I walked out. Thank you." Strangers were finding courage in her courage. Their lives were shifting because hers had cracked open. And while the world kept replaying her 34 seconds, Amara was living the unglamorous daily aftermath. Rent applications, legal paperwork, public judgment. But the ripples kept returning to her in unexpected ways, softening the edges of the struggle. It began with a message from a school counselor in Detroit. "I showed your speech to a group of girls. They stood up and clapped." Then an email from a professor in London. "My students want to build a seminar around your words." Then one from a woman in Louisiana. "I left my husband this morning. I couldn't have done it without you." Amara read each one. Some made her cry. Some made her laugh. Some made her feel less alone in the nights that still swallowed her whole. But the most surprising ripple came from inside the very institution that had once tried to silence her. Diane Whitmore had not forgotten the promise she made in the archive. Within 2 weeks of the gala, she called Amara to meet for tea. They sat in a sunlit corner of a Harlem cafe. Small, quiet, removed from the world of chandeliers and curated shadows. Diane opened her notebook and said, "Your father fought for doors to open. I think we can open one together." She laid out a proposal. The Leonard Johnson Fellowship, a fully funded program for first-generation scholars, teachers, and advocates committed to community justice, not corporate optics. 20 fellows per year, with mentorship, stipends, legal aid, and partnerships with public schools and grassroots organizations. Amara stared at her, breath caught somewhere between grief and awe. "You're serious?" she whispered. "Deadly," Diane replied. "If Ethan's world wants redemption, let it come through substance instead of speeches. Let it come through your father's legacy, not his manipulation." For the first time in months, Amara felt her father's spirit move through her. A rumble like thunder under the surface of her grief. "Yes," she said, "let's do it." Word of the fellowship spread, not through corporate newsletters, but through communities, through teachers, through parents, through organizers who had spent years fighting with too little and giving too much. Applications poured in, people who had survived incarceration, people who had escaped abusive marriages, people who'd been told their stories were too heavy, too angry, too difficult. People who had nearly disappeared and now wanted to rise again. Then came another ripple, unexpected, powerful. Ethan's firm called an emergency meeting, not to reprimand him for how he treated his wife, not to acknowledge the emotional violence he'd inflicted, but because the optics were unbearable. The board released a terse statement a week later. Ethan Clark had voluntarily chosen to step back from public representation. In truth, he'd been quietly removed. Amara learned the news the same way the rest of the world did, through a push notification. She felt no triumph, only relief, and the smallest flicker of mourning for the version of him who had once pretended to love her. But the ripples didn't stop there. Her workshop at the library expanded, first to 2 days a week, then to evening sessions. The library director upgraded her to a bigger room upstairs, where the light was softer and the walls were covered in murals painted by local kids. Then the college dean called. "We want you back," she said, "not just as a professor, as a program builder." A new adult education initiative. Courses in storytelling, community activism, narrative justice. A chance to turn the workshop on the basement floor into something bigger, something lasting. Amara's throat tightened. "Are you sure?" The dean laughed. "Everyone saw your speech. You think we're letting someone else claim you now?" But the ripple that hit her the hardest wasn't from an institution, or a press outlet, or a stranger online. It came from a 17-year-old boy in her workshop, Zane, who stayed after class one day, shifting nervously, holding out a crumpled piece of paper. "I finished it," he said. "The story you told me to keep working on." She read it slowly. A story about a young black boy raised between worlds, never enough for one, too much for the other. A story about fear and courage and wanting to be seen and wanting to not want that so badly. She reached the end. Her eyes stung. "Zane," she whispered, "this is stunning." He swallowed, voice small. "Do you think it could help someone, like your speech did?" The question fractured something in her chest. "Yes," she breathed. "Absolutely. It will. He nodded once, fiercely. Good. Then I want to read it at the next class. And just like that, she saw it. Clearly. Fully. Her viral clip wasn't the legacy. Her speech wasn't the legacy. Her anger wasn't the legacy. This was a room full of ordinary people realizing their voices carried power. A teenager brave enough to speak truth in front of others. A fellowship opening doors her father had fought to pry loose. A community rising because one woman refused to disappear. The real ripple was not online. It was alive, growing, multiplying, changing the air around her. And as she walked home through the evening light, snow melting on her coat, she understood something with crystalline clarity. Her father's legacy was not in the books he left behind. It was in the world she was helping build, story by story, voice by voice, moment by moment, from the ground up. 2 years later, Amara's apartment was small, sunlit, and entirely hers. Nothing matched, not the thrifted kitchen chairs, not the second-hand bookshelf, not the couch she'd bargained down from a stranger on Craigslist, but the space hummed with something the luxury high-rise never had. Peace. Warm, ordinary, earned peace. On the wall above her desk hung a photograph of Leonard, laughing in the garden behind his old building, sunlight caught in his beard. Below it, framed carefully, rested the page he'd written in blue ink years before. You already have the room. Fill it with your voice. The world is waiting. She did not read it every morning. She didn't need to. It lived inside her now. Her weekends were still spent at the library, though the basement room had long been replaced by the bright, renovated community auditorium the city had built after her program exploded. The Leonard Johnson Fellowship was entering its 3rd year. Fellows came from neighborhoods all across New York, educators, counselors, legal advocates, former inmates, single mothers, young men and women who'd once believed their stories were burdens to hide. Now they knew better. On this particular afternoon, Amara stood before a group of new fellows, watching them settle into their seats. She could see the tension in their shoulders, the flicker of hope behind guarded eyes. She recognized it because she had lived it. Welcome, she began softly. This is a space for truth, especially the truths you've been told are too messy, too angry, too much. A murmur of understanding moved through the room. Later, as the session ended and the fellows trickled out, one woman lingered. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled into a tight bun, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her folder. Dr. Johnson, she said, voice wavering, I left my marriage last week. I watched your video. I watched it 27 times. It's the only reason I believed I could survive. Amara's breath caught. You already were surviving, she said gently. You just needed someone to remind you. The woman began to cry, not the fragile kind, but the soul-cleansing kind. Amara hugged her, feeling the tremor of a life rebuilding itself. Across the room, Zane, now a freshman in a city college, was gathering his things. He caught Amara's eye and lifted a hand in a small, confident wave. He had read his story to a crowd of 200 last month. He'd cried halfway through, then finished with his chin high. After the hall emptied, Amara walked home slowly, letting the evening air settle around her. Brooklyn was alive in its familiar ways. Kids laughing on stoops, music drifting from open windows, the smell of food carts warming the streets. She passed the corner store Mr. Kim still ran, and he waved from behind the counter. Professor Johnson, he called. Your students always talk about you. You make good trouble. She laughed, trying my best. By the time she reached her building, the sun had dipped low, brushing the bricks with gold. She climbed the 3 flights of stairs, still a little winded, still grateful for every step, and unlocked her door. Inside, warmth greeted her. Not from wealth, not from status, from presence. She brewed chamomile tea, the cheap kind her father liked, and sat by the window, pulling one of his worn books onto her lap. Its margins were lined with his handwriting, arrows, questions, underlines that made the text feel alive. She opened to a page he'd once marked with a star. A line she'd read many times before. Freedom is looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself. The tears that rose were not heavy, not painful. They were soft, like memory returning home. Amara touched the glass beside her, seeing her reflection faintly blurred by the window pane. She recognized herself, not the polished, muted version Ethan once demanded, not the exhausted warrior she had been during the fallout, not even the viral figure the world claimed for a season. Just herself, whole, present, unafraid. She lifted her mug in a small, private salute to the man who'd taught her everything she needed long before she realized she'd need it. "Daddy," she whispered into the quiet room, "we did it. We opened the doors." Outside, the city hummed in its endless rhythm. Inside, Amara exhaled, a deep, full breath that felt like the completion of a promise. She was home, not in a building, not in a neighborhood, home in herself, home in her voice, home in the unshakable truth that dignity was never something the world could grant her. It was something she had finally remembered. And if her journey brought you even a flicker of strength, if her story reminded you of your own voice, your own worth, your own power, then keep walking with her. Follow along for more stories like this. Let your voice in the comments become part of the chorus. Share this with someone who might need it today. Because remembering your dignity isn't just a moment, it's a movement, and you are already part of it.